Welcome to the Hyperpolyglot Activist, Learn Languages, Make a Difference. My name is Dr. Carlos Yebra Lopez, and today we're going to explore a crucial distinction between language and languaging. Now, as you can see on the screen, first of all, we'll analyze language from the perspective of structural linguistics, where language is conceived of as an autonomous system of signs. Then we'll move to generative linguistics, where language is framed as mental grammar. And finally, we will analyze language from the perspective of critical linguistics, where language is a series of social practices and actions, i.e. languaging rather than language. So first of all, structural linguistics. Structural linguistics begins with the work of Ferdinand de Saussure, his famous course of linguistics. And there he defines language as a system of signs, first and foremost. These signs are also arbitrary, meaning they are sound meaning associations, but are established by arbitrary convention for each language. And it is precisely the conventional nature of the sign what explains the diversity of languages. For instance, as you can see here, we have various signifiers, such as dog, xiang, hund, perro. And then we have the thing they signify, the signified, i.e. the little fellow you can see in the center. So Saussure's point is that there is no resemblance between the language sign, dog, xiang, hund, perro, and the thing it represents, the signified. And that's what accounts for the diversity of languages, for the fact that we have dog in English, but xiang in French, etc. Now, he also established a crucial binary between langue, on the one hand, which is the abstract rules and conventions of a signifying system independent of individual users, and parole, on the other hand, where parole is the concrete instances of the use of langue by individuals in a series of speech acts. Now, this dichotomy is then recycled by Chomsky in his own work. And so we go from langue to competence, which is defined by Chomsky as the tacit knowledge of the language system. And then parole turns into performance, meaning the use of language in concrete situations. At any rate, the important thing to remember is that both Saussure and Chomsky focus on the first term of the binary. Saussure focuses his research on langue, whereas Chomsky, or at least the early Chomsky, focused his research on competence, which means that parole and performance are recognized as existing, but then left aside from their analysis. So when it comes to Chomsky, as we said, there are two different terms in the binary, competence and performance. And in particular, the early Chomsky was concerned with what he called universal grammar, understood as a certain set of structural rules that are innate to human cognition and therefore common to all languages, independent of sensory experience. And here we're going to see just a little bit more about universal grammar.
In advance of experience, the child is already equipped with an understanding of the basic structure of any human language. So we know, even in advance of inquiry, that there's going to be a fundamental invariant core to language.
Linguists have come to use the term universal grammar. It's a notion that there's some underlying set of characteristics that are true of all languages all over the world.
All human languages have something that is sort of nouny and something that is sort of verby. They all do. All human languages have a way to make things negative.
No way, Jose.
No way, Jose. All human languages have a way to ask a question.
If I'm asking a question,
I'll lower my eyebrows. Where are you from? What's your name? Who is that person?
All human languages have a way to indicate a difference between just one and more than one.
In the Eskimo languages, you have not only the singular, for example, ugait, one rabbit, ugait, two rabbits, ugait, three or more rabbits. And so it goes. Each language has a list of obligatory distinctions. Male, female, definite, indefinite, singular, plural, past, present. This is the stock of categories that the human mind uses to schematize experience. And Chomsky asked the question, why is this? Why are languages so similar? Why are they all cut from the same mold? And his answer was,
There are fixed invariant principles, fixed invariant structural principles, which are simply part of the human biological endowment and that determine what counts as a human language.
it's because the human brain is pre-wired to accept only certain kinds of languages. And that the grammatical properties of the languages of the world have those properties that they do because the human mind has those properties.
Those things which are true of all languages are the candidates for what the child comes into the world knowing about the nature of the language to which he is being exposed.
The child might very well have a plan for what is a possible rule in a human language. So languages can have verbs then objects or objects then verbs, but those are two possibilities that every language has one or the other of. And the child can simply worry about which of those two versions his language has. What he's got to pick up are the particular versions of the rules that everyone else in the community is using.
And at this point, I think it's important to watch out for what I frequently see from critical linguists, which is a strawman fallacy of both structural linguistics and generative linguistics, but particularly of the latter, particularly of Chomsky's philosophy. If we have a look at the overall philosophy of Chomsky from his beginnings to nowadays, he's still actively researching, we'll realize that his take on language is not exclusively on mental cognition. It's not exclusively focused on mental cognition. Sure, that's part and parcel of his investigations, and he was focused on this realm in his early works. But as anybody who is familiarized with Chomsky knows, he also has plenty of works dealing with political issues that are themselves connected to his analysis of language. So it will be unfair to describe Chomsky as just a formalist. There is much more to Chomsky, and there is an underlying connection between his takes on language, cognition, and politics, respectively. Now, as I said before the video on universal grammar, the important thing to retain is that even though both Saussure and Chomsky recognized these two dimensions of language, langue versus parole in the case of Saussure, and competence versus performance in the case of Chomsky, both Saussure and the early Chomsky focused on the first term of the binary, langue in the case of Saussure and competence in the case of Chomsky. What critical linguistics does is the opposite. Critical linguistics focuses on what Saussure called parole and what Chomsky called performance. Now, we could say that social linguistics in general and critical linguistics in particular owes a great deal to the work of Mikhail Bakhtin, a Russian philosopher who was also concerned with literary critique. In particular, he developed the notion of heteroglossia, which comes from the Greek hetero, different, and glossa, tongue or language, and refers to the coexistence of distinct varieties within a single language. According to Mikhail Bakhtin, language is interactively linked to the context in which it exists, as opposed to what Saussure and the early Chomsky were doing, which was isolating a particular realm of language, langue, or competence, and focusing on it in isolation from context. Mikhail Bakhtin stresses the fact that this is not possible because language is always already interactively linked with the context of use. Moreover, language is incapable of so-called neutrality because it always emerges from the actions of particular speakers who already have a given perspective and a certain ideological take. And this work is continued by the likes of Volosinov, who was a Marxist philosopher of language. And crucially, he claimed that language acquires life in, I quote, concrete verbal communication, and not in the abstract linguistic system of language forms, nor in the individual psyche of speakers. Again, speaking against structural linguistics and generative linguistics. So all in all, the shift from language to languaging is the shift from language as a simple system of structures independent of human actions with others, and language understood as a dialogical process between ourselves and our language practices as we interact and make meaning in the world. And this process is best described not so much as language as languaging. And as Becker emphasized from the perspective of translation, the fact that we use the category of languaging rather than language is because we are defining language as an ongoing process. And so the ending in ing in languaging covers this aspect more accurately. And there is a further implication of this. Since languaging shapes our experiences, stores them, retrieves them, and communicates them in an open-ended process, Becker says, then learning a new form of language is not really about learning a new code, as presupposed by structural linguists and generative linguists, but it's actually about entering another history of interactions and cultural practices and learning a, I quote, new way of being in the world, which is a crucial conception that we'll see in further authors. Learning a new form of language is learning a new way of being in the world. This conception of languaging is inherited by post-structuralist critical language scholars, among which the names that you can see on the screen. And here, the idea is that they conceptualize language as a series of social practices and actions by speakers that are embedded in a web of social and cognitive relations. And all of this is entangled together. Now, to this conceptualization, one needs to add a critique of nation-state/colonial language ideologies. And the end result is that language is now seen as a contested space that is constantly reappropriated by actual language users. So there's an emphasis on the fluidity of local language practices of all speakers and the agency of those speakers. As Pennycook famously says in his 2010 work, to look at language as a practice is to view language as an activity rather than a structure, as something we do rather than a system we draw on, as a material part of social and cultural life rather than an abstract entity. So when we move from language to languaging, we also shift the very question we're asking. We're no longer asking ourselves the Fishmanian question, the question posed by the social linguist Joshua Fishman, who speaks or writes what language or what language variety to whom, when, and to what end. Now we're asking ourselves a different question altogether, which is the one suggested by Jefferman. Who languages how, and what is being languaged under what circumstances in a particular place and time? You see the difference? Now we're no longer recognizing the existence of languages as self-discrete autonomous entities. Now we're talking about the activity of languaging. Therefore, who languages how, and what is being languaged under what circumstances in a given place and time. So as stressed by Makoni and Pennycook, language is not an objective notion. The idea of a language as a discrete, autonomous, self-contained entity is actually a European invention, a product of colonialism and nationalist romanticist ideology, according to which language and identity were intrinsically linked. So if you were born in Germany, you had to speak German, and vice versa. However, what Makoni and Pennycook are emphasizing here is that languages are not real entities in the world. They do not exist in the world out there. Rather, they are discursive constructs, or, as they say, inventions of social, cultural, and political movements. And their very invention cannot be detached from an understanding of those movements. And here Canagarajah takes this one step further and applies this shift from language to languaging to the shift from code switching, the idea that we switch between different codes or languages, from Spanish to German, from German to English, etc., to translanguaging, which presupposes that there is no switch between languages. There is rather a unified repertoire from which people who know several quote-unquote languages draw all the time to simply express themselves. So in the words of this author, we're all translinguals, not native speakers of a single language in homogeneous environments. Now, this is, of course, a fascinating insight. If you want to know more about the difference between code switching and translanguaging, I made a video apropos this difference, and I think that you will really enjoy watching it. And also, you might want to check my critique of the notion of native speaker here. Let me know if you have any doubts or questions in the comments down below. And as always, thanks for watching.